today is, I've got to read the paper. It's a shortened version, and I hope it won't, by virtue of being shortened, turn out to be hard to follow, or incoherent. It's a shortened version of a paper that is in fact accepted more or less for publication in a philosophy journal. They want the journal editors have called for elaboration of a few points, and I haven't really got round yet to working out the changes that are needed, but I'm hoping that I might get some hints today as to things that perhaps might profitably be changed in this paper. Following eye surgery, I find that I'm much happier looking, as it were, reading the more or less horizontal plane and looking down. So I'm going to try to block out the view of you or your view of me, but if you wonder why I'm holding the paper, as it were, like this rather than looking down, it's because it is better for my rather now faulty eyesight. Paper of virtuous condemnation, you might wonder perhaps what that's got to do with forgiveness. Well, I'm going to try to explain in the course of this paper. It's got really quite a lot to do with forgiveness. But forgiveness is, as Anthony says in his paper that we're going to be hearing after lunch, it's a member of a kind of family of responses to wrongdoing. And I have thought for quite a while that condemnation as a member of this family is one that's had rather a bad press. And I want to try to say a few defensive things. I'm certainly not defending condemnation in all circumstances, but I think there are instances where condemnation can be not just admissible, permissible, but positively virtuous, positively meritorious. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you of now. So I'll get on with the paper. I think it'll take about 35 minutes to read, but if I find that the pace suggests it's going to be longer than that, then I'll maybe make some omissions towards the end. Right, off we go. So first section, introduction. Condemnation as a response to wrongdoing has not found much favour with recent philosophers. To condone an offence is to overlook or discount it, even though one judges it to be wrong. Unsurprisingly, condemnation has struck many writers as a morally inadequate response to acts that probably merit overt disapproval, indignation, protest or punishment. Turning a blind eye to others' misdeeds can seem indicative of a moral laxness or laziness that a virtuous agent would avoid. Condoning a bad act seems close to complicity in wrongdoing, if, as in the criminal law, silence is taken to give consent. At best, not protesting an offence smacks of culpable apathy or insouciance. No wonder then that moral philosophers have not generally condoned condemnation. But is it always wrong to condone an offence? Imagine that one witnesses a colleague who one knows to be under considerable stress at present, uncharacteristically treating a subordinate with discourtesy. Should one make an issue of the incident? Possibly not if one considers it unlikely to be repeated. Reproving the offender, even if one has the status and authority to do so, might only increase his sense of stress and make a further offence more likely. Better to let it go this time without comment. If the offence should be repeated, then one may need to intervene, but the prudent course now is to do nothing. That way one spares the feelings of the offender, who may be deeply embarrassed if taken to task for his behaviour. One is not one's brother's conscience, and fraternity is often best served by maintaining a discreet silence about another's faults. Of course, such discretion can be taken too far. If the colleague's bad behaviour is repeated, one may be duty-bound to take some positive action to stop such actions becoming habitual. If gentle hints prove inadequate, then one may need to proceed to formal warnings and to disciplinary action. Failing to do so would amount to condemnation of a morally unacceptable kind. But as this schematic example should help to show, condoning wrong acts is not always out of moral order. Sometimes to condone a wrong act is just what we ought to do. Condemnation, in short, can be morally either good or bad. In this paper, I want to take issue with the standard negative appraisal of condemnation and argue that in some, certainly not in all cases, To condone a moral or criminal act is not only permissible, but positively virtuous. There are some precedents for this more sympathetic position, though I shall go further than other writers in defending condonation. For instance, Glenn Pettigrove claims that unless, quote, moral agents are obliged to denounce every wrong, it may sometimes be acceptable to overlook others' misdeeds and not insist on holding wrongdoers at an emotional distance. We do not have the time, energy, status or opportunity to protest every wrong that comes to our notice. Besides, as Aurel Colnay has remarked, a distinct reticence to condemn serves us well if we are to live peacefully alongside one another. Moral busybodies are unpopular folk and can be an irritating social nuisance. And while forgiveness generally gets a much better press than condemnation, W.R. Neblett points out that particularly where minor offences are concerned, it is often impossible to distinguish between the two, since the one trades into the other. But all these writers give at most one cheer for condemnation, saying it is sometimes tolerable, but undeserving of any special praise. In contrast, I shall argue that condemnation is sometimes distinctly meritorious to the offences of others, and not just in the most trivial cases. The graciousness to overlook the failings of others is morally more attractive than a readiness always to rush to judgment. Section 2. What condemnation is and isn't. In defining what is wrong with condemnation, it has been common to compare it disparagingly with forgiveness. The shorter Oxford Dictionary, however, runs the two together. To condone is, quote, to forgive or overlook an offence, especially to forgive tacitly by not allowing the offence to make any difference to one's relations with the offender. End of the dictionary quotation. This definition will not appeal to writers who make both a conceptual and a moral distinction between forgiveness and condemnation. However, the second clause of the definition suggests one feature of condemnation that might more readily be granted, namely that condemnation is frequently a silent exercise. Forgiveness may sometimes be tacit too, but it is more commonly meant to be recognised by its recipient for what it is, and to stimulate an appropriate response. The literature on forgiveness has emphasised the moral clear-sightedness ideally involved in giving and receiving forgiveness, whereby the wrong done is duly recognised by both parties, even while it ceases to be a ground of ill will or resentment. Ideally, the forgiven offender should be aware of the badness of his action and suitably remorseful. But whereas forgiveness typically brings an offence out into the open between offender and offended, condemnation more usually involves passing over it in silence. There can, however, be exceptions to this. I have said that to condone is to overlook an offence. But not all overlooking of an offence need be tacit. One may sometimes be quite open with an offender, telling him that one is prepared to let his offence pass in this instance, perhaps adding that one may not be so tolerant another time. This is not, I think, the same as forgiving him, and here I side with those writers who find the two responses distinct. Suppose one says to an offender, OK, we'll let it pass on this occasion. Here one is not so much forgiving the offence as bracketing it off, treating it as if it had not occurred. Instead of facing it head-on, as in forgiveness, one bypasses or overlooks it, regarding it as calling for no further moral response, including forgiveness. However, even where the reasons for doing so are good ones, stemming from tolerance, generosity or a merciful spirit, rather than moral carelessness, one may want to docket the offence in memory and be on the alert for future offences of a similar kind. For serial wrongdoing, and like one-off offences, is less likely to be condonable by the morally virtuous agent. Thus, neither forgiving nor condoning normally involves forgetting what has been. In defining the act of condoning as one of overlooking an offence, the shorter Oxford Dictionary, I think, captures one crucial aspect of the term's ordinary language meaning more accurately than some philosophers have done. When one condones what one takes to be an offence. I want to emphasise that. One condones what one takes to be an offence. But this is not how recent philosophers have generally understood condonation. On their view, to condone a bad act is to treat it as not really being wrong at all, or as being too insignificant to be worth any fuss. So, for instance, although Nebulous, I've already quoted, regards condonation as shading into forgiveness, he takes the view that to condone someone's behaviour is by definition to dismiss that behaviour as not being wrong in the first place. Seen this way, condonation certainly does seem a morally suspect aspect to wrongdoing, reflecting either a moral purblindness that sees wrong as right, or a moral carelessness that trivialises wrongdoing or the need to respond to it. According to Trudy Gauvier, the trouble with condonation is that it takes so much lightly that it ought to be taken seriously, thus implying that it is somehow permissible or justified. This, she thinks, is something that forgiveness, to its credit, never does. Acknowledging that forgiveness that is granted immediately, without much time for reflection, may sometimes suggest, that's her word, suggest condoning, Gauvier nonetheless insists that, quote, for clear logical reasons to forgive is not to condone. To avoid giving any impression that a person is condoning rather than forgiving, she advises that he should clearly, quote, articulate the sense that what was done was wrong, but that the wrongness of the act has not determined his overall attitude to the agent. The same misconstruction of condonation reappears in Eve Garrod and David McNaughton's otherwise admirable book, Forgiveness. They consider condonation to be wrong because it involves skewed moral judgment, in which one takes black to be white, or grey at the worst. When we condone an action, they hold, quote, we say in effect that it wasn't really such a bad thing to do. Using the example of the long-running scandal of MPs of the Westminster Parliament cheating on their expenses claims, they imagine someone reacting, well, that wasn't really so bad, was it? No government ever wants to raise MPs' pay because it's always unpopular with the electorate. It wasn't such a terrible thing. The whole expenses scandal cost less than a decent pay rise for them would have done. End of quote. But this denial that what the MPs did was wrong removes this case from the category of condonation properly understood. Garrod and McNaughton write that, quote, condoning an action amounts to saying, correctly or incorrectly, that an action wasn't really wrong, adding that not only is condoning not forgiving, but that it rules out forgiveness, since one can only forgive what one takes to be wrong. But this must be incorrect, for if condonation, properly so-called, also involves the recognition of wrongdoing, it cannot rule out forgiveness for the reason given by Garrod and McNaughton. Although forgiveness normally involves drawing the offender's attention to the offence, while condonation only sometimes does, there is no reason in principle why forgiveness of a more tacit kind and condonation should not co-occur. Moreover, by inserting the parenthesis correctly or incorrectly, this was in the this is the trouble with reading a paper that originally was written to be read. The quotation was from Garrod and McNaughton: condoning an action amounts to saying correctly or incorrectly that an action wasn't really wrong. So, by inserting the parenthesis correctly or incorrectly, Garrod and McNaughton cloud the issue further. For where one correctly judges an act to be innocent, one cannot then condone it, since in the absence of an acknowledged bad act, there is nothing to condone. What all these authors are discussing is not condonation, but rather an exercise of lax moral judgment. To repeat, someone who condones an act recognises its wrongness, but lets it pass without acting in any of the ways that customarily express our reaction to wrongdoing. For example, reprimand, remonstrance, expression of outrage or disappointment, imposition of sanctions, or reporting the offence to some appropriate authority. In omitting to act, it may, of course, be responding properly or improperly. But while the absence of any reproving or punitive actions or gestures may suggest that the offence is not being condemned as it ought to be, the appearance is misleading. The logic of condonation rules out a response to wrongdoing counting as genuine condonation if the person who responds disbelieves that the act in question is really wrong. Here it exactly parallels the logic of forgiveness. One mistaking wrong for right displays a faulty moral compass. Passing over an act that one recognises to be wrong can sometimes indicate a refined moral sensitivity, so I shall argue. But what sort of inaction is involved when one condones an act that one takes to be wrong? Condonation does not consist merely in an attitude of passive disapproval, an outward or inward raising of the eyebrows. Indeed, as we have seen, in condoning an offence, one may sometimes make crystal clear to the offender that one is aware of his act, disapproves of it, yet is prepared to pay it no further attention. Bracketing off the offence like this represents what Randolph Clark, is a philosopher of action, represents what Randolph Clark calls, quote, a manifestation of agency, in the sense that when one condones, one deliberately chooses not to act where one could have acted if one had chosen to do so. Differently put, one performs an intentional act of omission. Turning a blind eye is not the same as being unsighted. In condoning, one notices the faulty behaviour but decides to overlook it on the present occasion. Because our individual abilities, resources and opportunities to prevent wrongdoing are limited and usually restricted to a narrow sphere, most of the wrongdoing in the world we have to let pass because there's no alternative. Although collective action may sometimes accomplish what individual endeavour cannot, there is often nothing we can do about wrongdoing beyond recording our disapproval. I think in contexts in which no effective action is possible, it's not really apposite to speak of condoning bad acts. Our inability to act rules out our performing any acts of omission also. More interesting are cases in which we could effectively reprove or punish wrongdoing if we so chose, but where doing so would be quixotic or expressive of impertinence or arrogance. One needs to have the appropriate status to intervene or to condone. Here it is worth distinguishing between bad acts committed against oneself and ones committed against other people. In deciding to overlook wrong acts of which I am the target, I may act well or badly, wisely or unwisely, but I stay within my proper sphere of concern. But while wrong acts committed against me are plainly my business, those of which others are the victims may or may not be, depending on the nature of my relationship with them. Don Quixote repeatedly found to his cost that not all victims of oppression welcome having their wrongs righted by a complete stranger. I added a footnote to that at that point, was pointing out that one might say rather similar things about the Afghan and Iranian interventions by Western powers, but anyway, I thought I better have that in the text in case this went to an American reviewer. It would not be easy to state precisely what conditions must be in place for one person rightly to intervene in the event of another's wrongdoing. But where intervention would be morally improper, the question of whether to condone or not does not arise. Indeed, the very possibility of condonation presupposes a relevant relationship with at least one of the perpetrator or the victim of wrongdoing. Still, it would be wrong to let a fear of invading others' personal spaces become a pretext for maintaining a totally hands-off attitude. And there could be no moral community where everyone confined her attention solely to her own affairs. A failure to respond to what one recognises as wrongdoing, when motivated by laziness, fear, moral indifference, inadequate sympathy with suffering, or some other blameworthy state of character or mind, may amount to condonation of a vicious sort. While we might not assist an agent to perform some bad act, the negative act of not preventing or reprehending it can make us sharers in the agent's guilt. Finally, in this section, a section of what condonation is and isn't, condoning a harmful act is to be distinguished from excusing it. I might just say, as a preface to this last paragraph I'm going to read in this section, I think this section needs some considerable rework. I'm not as satisfied with it now as I was when I wrote it a few months ago. But anyway, I'll read it for what it's worth. The difference between condoning and excusing is that in the former case we take the agent to be morally blameworthy for her action, whereas in the latter we do not, on account of the extenuating circumstances or the particular mental condition of the agent. According to Garrard and McNaughton, excusing an act, quote, amounts to saying that yes, it really was wrong, but the person who committed it wasn't to blame because of his special circumstances, end of quote. But I think this is incorrect for two reasons. First, we sometimes excuse an action that causes harm but is not morally wrong, as when we excuse Tom for accidentally running over the cat that suddenly jumped in front of his car. If Tom was driving at a reasonable speed and wasn't expecting the cat's leap, then his driving over Felix was a morally innocent act. But suppose next that Tom, after being subjected to sustained contemptuous treatment by Tim, lost his temper and punched Tim on the jaw. This is a token of a type of act that would normally count as wrong, though in this case Tom might be held wholly or partly excusable on account of the previous provocation. This example illustrates a second snag with Garrard and McNaughton's definition of excusing, namely the tension involved in holding that an act can be wrong even though the agent who performs it is not morally blameworthy. For it would be better to say, I think, or perhaps, that an act that would normally be wrong is not wrong when the agent, because of his special circumstances, is morally blameless in performing it. In brackets, all right. Special circumstances can also include abnormal psychological drives and complexes which reduce the agent's level of responsibility. Note that if Tom could fairly be held to bear some moral blame for striking Tim, then someone with the pertinent authority to take responsive action, but who decided not to do so, would be condoning his act rather than excusing it. While condonation is sometimes tantamount to negative complicity in wrongdoing, this is by no means always so. Often condonation is distinctly virtuous. Overlooking another's wrongful behaviour is sometimes not just what we may do, but what it behoves us as virtuous agents to do, as I shall now try to show. You may be relieved to know that the final few pages of the essay descend from a rather high level of abstraction to get some slightly more down-to-earth kinds of case in which we might condone, so I think it becomes slightly easier going. As I say, it was a paper meant basically to be read rather than read out, so I'm sorry if it has seemed a little hard to follow in places. Anyway, let me go on. In this part of the paper, when condonation may be virtuous, I shall try to identify some kinds of situation in which condonation can express moral virtue. This is not an exhaustive list of all possible cases, it's really just like, a sample of possibilities. First category, A, peacemaking and reconciliation. The familiar saying, do justice even though the heavens fall, places a high, many would say too high, price on the promotion of a value that can sometimes come into conflict with others. And even where people agree that justice should be done, they often disagree on what doing it actually involves. A fact familiar to international mediators is that where contending populations each believe they are more sinned against than sinning, the process of reconciliation is likely to stall if it concentrates too much on the search for an elusive, just solution. Bringing divided people together often requires a willingness to overlook offences which, if held in focus, could undermine a peace and reconciliation process. Imagine that two communities divided on ethnic lines are for a long time engaged in mutually hostile action but are finally prepared to sink their differences and reach a modus vivendi. Then, just as a peace deal is about to be signed, some disgruntled members of one community stage a last violent street demonstration to mark their dislike of the new arrangements. During the event, several demonstrators, police and other citizens are injured, and a considerable amount of property is destroyed. How should the authorities react? They may wisely consider that responding to the incident with the full force of the law would seriously jeopardise the hard-won agreement and risk restarting the old cycle of violence. Perhaps they should not ignore the demonstration completely. To let it pass without comment would be taking condonation too far. but they may reasonably choose to adopt a light touch approach, publicly condemning the demonstration but refraining from prosecution of the ringleaders and other participants. Such partial condemnation of the demonstration, if it facilitates the establishment of a stable and lasting peace, may well be thought warranted on pragmatic grounds. But the love of peace and the desire to replace strife with harmony can also express that high virtue that is appalled by the sight of human beings who are constantly at one another's throats. B. Acratic lapses. To quote another common saying, to err is human. Even generally well-behaving people may sometimes fall below their own moral standards, reflecting the radical evil, i.e. the proneness to temptation born of self-love, that Kant thought characteristic of all human beings. When they do so, condemnation may often be more appropriate than condemnation. A person who is trying hard to cure a bad habit may usually succeed in resisting temptation, but on the odd occasion fail to do so. Overlooking errors of this kind, which are acratic lapses from virtue rather than the products of a settled bad will, is often the most sensible as well as the most gracious response. Reprimanding or punishing acratic lapses may have a very disheartening effect on an agent who is sincerely committed to self-improvement. Where encouragement and support are needed, a condemnatory response may create confidence-sapping shame and embarrassment. In any case, unless our own lives are particularly saintly, such propensity to carp at and criticise others may also indicate an unwarranted sense of moral superiority on our part. Still, the fear of being or seeming hypocritical should not deter those with the responsibility to prevent or punish wrongdoing from discharging it. Category C, uncharacteristic misdeeds. Distinguishable from lapses of the foregoing sort, acratic lapses are lapses owing to that stem from weakness of will, but distinguishable from lapses of that kind are bad deeds that are performed by agents who are temporarily behaving out of character and who may afterwards scarcely know themselves why they did what they did. Such wrong acts are interestingly different from those that stem from a flawed moral character or one that is still forming. People do occasionally act in wrong ways that surprise themselves as much as they do others. The usually placid office manager who barks at a subordinate, or the generally honest student who on the spur of the moment steals a library book, act in ways that in a cooler hour they may consider to be unlike themselves. Disciplining an office manager for mistreating his junior, or cancelling the student's library membership, might not be incompatible with justice, but these harsh responses would be conspicuously lacking in mercy and compassion. Virtuous condemnation in these cases might therefore consist either in taking no punitive action, or else in a quick reprimand coupled with a promise to say no more about the matter, perhaps on the explicit condition that the bad behaviour is not repeated. D. Immaturity. Maybe the student case could have fitted into this category as well. Condemnation may also be fitting, I should say, where the offender's misbehaviour can be put down to immaturity or naivety born of a lack of relevant knowledge or experience. When a youngster acts in a foolish, brash, boastful or insensitive manner that typifies his years, turning a blind eye on some occasions may be preferable to making a moral meal of it. Where offenders can reasonably be expected to, quote, grow out of it, taking them to task for minor bad behaviour, especially if this would cause considerable shame, may be a counterproductive tactic. Far better for their moral development to leave them to learn from their own mistakes. Moral educators should aim to strike the right balance between overmuch direction, which inhibits the young person's progress to moral independence, and a laissez-faire approach that sends the message that anything goes. Just as in academic education, the overzealous correction of a student's every fault can sap confidence and breed a dislike of learning, in its moral counterpart, the reprimanding every minor peccadillo may instill contempt for morality as a prison for the free spirit. I might mention that the referee was particularly hard on this section, thinking I was far too, I don't maybe had some bad experiences with parents or something. Young people need a lot more direction than I claim they do. I have to think about that. I realise this is taking slightly longer than I think I shall cut out some of my questions.
Keep going.
Okay then. I'll maybe can reduce a little bit. Category E, prior repentance. Where a wrongdoer is sorry for an offence, it may be superfluous for others to reprimand him. He's already seen the error of his ways. A mean, deceitful or uncharitable act for which the agent is truly sorry can be disregarded by others unless their silence is likely to be misconstrued as indicating approval. I wouldn't miss out the next thing. I think the situation may be different in the case of a criminal offence, perhaps for a couple of reasons. One, I think the law has to treat everyone the same. You can't be overlooking some cases and not others. Certainly, officers of the law, I think we can't afford to be turning a blind eye to some cases and not others. So I've skipped a few lines, but I conclude this section by saying condemnation of offences, therefore, may have little place in the practice of the law. But where such public interests are not involved, as is commonly the case outside the context of the criminal law, criticism of an offender who is already sincerely critical of himself can be condemnatory overkill. F. Trivial misdeeds. A trivial wrong deed is still a wrong deed, in principle meriting reproof and perhaps a penalty. But one reason why it is sometimes virtuous to condone trivial misdeeds is that taking note of them would display an unattractive moral preciousness or overzealousness. Criticising or being standoffish towards a person on account of some minor piece of wrongdoing may also indicate a readiness to see the mote in another's eye while missing the plank in one's own. In the words of William Godwin, the early utilitarian, quote, persons who are so ungraciously eager to condemn a character for the first displeasing appearance, for the merest trifle, for anything or for nothing, while they pretend to be doing homage at the shrine of sincerity, will generally be found to be merely gratifying their own peevishness, that's right, and the undue acrimony of their temper. That's Godwin in 1797. Godwin advises that when we do take others to task for their faults, we should accompany our reprimands with proofs of kindness, and take care above all to avoid assuming, quote, the tone of a master, since, at this usurpation, human independence reasonably spurns. Marvellous language. Jumping on every small fault a person commits is likely to be counterproductive, because people are often more willing to accept reproof for their serious offences than for their minor ones, where criticism can seem mere nitpicking. And where censure of another's minor moral failings has become routine, occasional reproof for genuinely serious offences may pass unheeded. My final category I'm going to, there are more in the paper, but the final category I mention is category G, friendship. In his essay on friendship, Cicero wrote that, quote, for varied and complex are the experiences of friendship, and they afford many causes for suspicion and offence, which it is wise sometimes to ignore, Latin word is evitare, sometimes to make light of, elevare, and sometimes to endure, ferre. Friends, he thought, should be ready to admonish one another when they are at the receiving end of serious offences or witness their commission against others. And when they do this, they should take care that, quote, advice be free from harshness and reproof be free from insult. A very similar perhaps in sentiment to Godwin. But to make a meal of every minor failing, lapse or piece of thoughtlessness in a friend is to poison one's friendship with him. It is therefore more sensible to be more tolerant and forbearing towards one's friends than we may wish to be towards other people. Interestingly, Cicero's threefold prescription for dealing with the minor bad behaviour of our friends does not include forgiveness as one of the modes. Of the three he does cite, the first, the ignoring of an offence, is probably the closest to condemnation as I have characterised it. The second, making light of an offence, seems to be rather a diplomatic pretence that what happened doesn't matter. as when one tells one's friend with a forced smile that one isn't put out by his late arrival at the restaurant. The final mode Cicero recommends is that of bearing or putting up with an offence. This approaches condemnation insofar as it involves the first mode, that of ignoring the offence, but one might also put up with an offence while making it clear to one's friend that one does so unwillingly. You might say, I put it so far with your always being late, but I do wish that in future you try to be on time. The general thrust of Cicero's analysis of the moral dynamics of friendship is that the relationship requires give and take, a measure of complaisance and the avoidance of standing on a moral dignity. If we value friendship and wish to make and keep friends, a readiness to overlook their minor faults and offences, or at least those that are committed against ourselves, is a vital component of a friendly spirit. Right, I now move to my concluding section, which is going to take, I hope, 3 or 4 minutes to read. In this paper, I've tried to clarify the nature of condemnation as it figures in ordinary moral thought and action, and have sought to offer a limited defence of it against some common criticisms. Condemnation, I've argued, can be either proper or improper, depending on the context and attendant circumstances. In showing how condemnation of a bad act can sometimes be appropriate, I've sought to identify some of the virtues with which it may be associated. Compassion and mercy, a tolerant acceptance of human frailty, moral and intellectual humility, peaceableness and a love of amity, an indisposition to carp and criticise, and a due respectfulness for others' autonomy as moral agents. Of course, well-intentioned acts of condemnation that flow from these virtues may not always be wise. It is possible to be too tolerant, too long-suffering, or so imbued with a sense of our own imperfections that a fear of being or appearing hypocritical inhibits any active expression of moral indignation. Hence the need for practical wisdom to guide our virtuous intentions and strike the right balance between too much and too little responsiveness. In contrast, bad, as distinct from virtuous but unwise, condemnation may be symptomatic of several vices. For example, a cavalier attitude to right and wrong, laziness, inertia, lack of interest in or sympathy with our fellow men, tolerance of the intolerable, or a self-deluding disposition to think it beneath one's dignity to notice the faults and weaknesses of others. Well, even if condemnation is granted to be sometimes virtuous, might it not be thought a somewhat bloodless sort of virtue that is manifested through inaction? I've argued that condemnation should be seen as an expression of agency, and pointed out that there can be acts of omission as well as commission. Nevertheless, by comparison with such exercises of active virtue as laying down one's life for a friend, jumping into a river to save a drowning child, or standing up to a cruel dictator, overlooking another's wrongdoing, even where it is the right thing to do, seems relatively dull and unexciting. There are 2 responses to this charge. The first is simply to accept that virtuous condemnation is not the most eye-catching of virtues, or one that demonstrates the finest behaviour of which human beings are capable. No prizes or public commendations go to those who condone. Since condemnation consists in an intentional omission to act, it will often pass unnoticed even by the wrongdoer whose action is condoned. But it would be a crude understanding of virtue that suppose that all manifestations of virtue must be conspicuous and colourful. If some expressions of virtue resemble symphony orchestras performing in full blast, others play the quieter chamber music of the moral soul. I like that, actually. So, virtuous dispositions which prompt condemnation at the right time and place are genuine and important components of a good character, and someone who lacks them is incomplete in her moral makeup. If they do not readily draw attention to themselves, their exercise is nevertheless expressive of a refined moral sensibility. The second response to the charge, this is a rather exciting virtue, is to note that virtuous condemnation need not stand alone as a reaction to wrongdoing, but is frequently accompanied by positive actions designed to counter the harm that is being done, or to induce the wrongdoer to reflect on the error of his ways. One might, for instance, set the offender a good example in one's own behaviour, attempt to wean him away from bad habits or bad companions, praise others in his hearing who have managed to resist temptation, or display one's concern for the people he has harmed. Such ameliorative action nicely complements the omission to be explicitly critical, sit on a moral high horse, or resort to the cruder weaponry of sanctions and punishment. It may also be more effective in stimulating second thoughts and finer feelings in the wrongdoer. As part of a package of measures to counteract wrongdoing and its effects, condemnation is not a mere fenial reaction to wrongdoing. And even in those circumstances in which other parts of the package are unavailable, it may still be amply justified as the expression of a moral humility that is reluctant to cast the first stone. Thank you, and I'm sorry I have to go to Birmingham.
Well, I will come up and help you point to quite people who want to ask questions. And I have some myself. I always defer. I'm always a bit upset when the chair abuses authority. That's the first question. Is there another immediate?
So I can go ahead and ask a question. I mean, it was just terrific. Thank you. And I think it's wonderfully unsettling, this paper, because I just ended up thinking, well, what is the difference between forgiveness and condemnation? How would you distinguish the two? What defence of forgiveness would you make as something discrete?
I think that I do agree with Glenn Pettigrew that the two shade into each other. So, I think if one gives definitions of either, which represent them as being, discontinuous, then one is going to be, I think, misrepresenting the nature of each. But I think forgiveness, for me, it has typically more of a focus. If you're forgiving someone, it has typically more of a focus on seeking some sort of reconciliation. Maybe there's an inward and an outward side of it. I mean, inwardly, you're trying to, as it were, I'm really very, very much following Bishop Butler here. You're trying to, as it were, relinquish or go more lightly on your own sense of resentment or offence. That's what you're working on yourself. But you're also outward sense. You're kind of working to perhaps restore some sort of status quo ante, I suppose, with the person you're forgiving. Often I think this is going to need some sort of conversation. I'm using that term in a rather general sense, not just talking, but all sorts of actions, reactions, involved as well. Condemnation is ultimately going to be, well, I think there's not usually going to be quite as much internal work to do in condemnation. One is often, I said that I think in order for talk of condemnation to make any sense, one has to have a certain kind of status. That status may not always be that of the offended party, in which case one may not have any resentment, so it is not for you to forgive. It may be that, for instance, a parent's child has misbehaved in relation to another child. The parent who's observed the misbehaviour may think, well, should I intervene on this occasion? Or should I condone? Should I let my child's behaviour pass? Now, here, condemnation is in the frame, whereas forgiveness would be. I mean, there's more to it. To give a full answer would take, I think, quite a long time. But I think, to just repeat, I think Pettigrew is right that the two do shade into each other. There are cases where it's hard to say whether it's condemnation or forgiveness. I think the more paradigmatic or the more, the cases which are more distinctive